I'm Leta Hong Fincher, and I'm the author of the book Leftover Women, The Resurgence of Gender Inequality in China. I came upon the term 剩女, leftover women, in one of the interviews that I did with a young woman who was 26 years old, and she was about to get married, and she had just purchased a marital home with her boyfriend. But she had left her name off the property deed in spite of the fact that she had transferred all of her life savings over to her boyfriend. So I asked her why she was doing that. Why didn't she put her name on the deed? And then she said that she was at that so-called leftover age, and she was very worried about getting married quickly, otherwise she would become too old to find a husband. When I looked into the origins of the term leftover woman, I realized that in January 2007, China's State Council came out with a very important population decision. And this decision said that China faces unprecedented population pressures due to the so-called low quality of its population that will make it very difficult for China to compete in the global marketplace. So the government set a key goal of so-called upgrading population quality. And I argue that this attempt to upgrade population quality is really closely linked to the aggressive pushing of the term leftover women, stigmatizing the urban educated women who are considered to be, by the government, the highest quality people in the population, to get them to hurry up and marry and have a child for the good of the nation. Another reason why I believe the government is really aggressively pushing urban educated women in their 20s to get married is simply because it wants to promote social stability. China has a sex ratio imbalance that's very severe. There are about 117 boys born for every 100 girls. And that's resulted in an excess tens of millions of men who will be unable to find brides in the future. And so I believe that this marriage promotion campaign is really focusing on getting the most educated women in China to lower their standards and to marry some of these excess men in the population, and that this marriage promotion will help to promote social stability. One of the things I focus on in this book is the very close link between marriage and home buying in China. There's, in addition to intense pressure to marry, there is intense pressure to buy a very expensive home on the private real estate market. And I argue that Chinese women have been shut out of what is probably the largest accumulation of residential property wealth in history, which is worth over 30 trillion US dollars as of last year. And this is due to a lot of factors. Most homes in China tend to be registered only in the man's name. Parents in China tend to buy homes only for their sons and not for their daughters. And many of the women getting married often transfer their life savings over to their boyfriend or their fiancé to finance the purchase of a marital home, but then the women leave their name off the deed. So they're forfeiting ownership of this incredibly valuable asset, which is the most valuable asset in the Chinese household. And I believe this is linked in part to the intense stigma of being single in China as an educated woman. Some of the women have told me that they are too anxious about not finding another husband, and so that's why they don't want to push too aggressively to put their name on the property deed. Well, China has a really severe epidemic of domestic violence. Official statistics say that about a quarter of married women have suffered domestic violence, but when you talk to feminist activists working on this issue, they say that the real incidence of domestic violence is much higher than that. And I argue that women's lack of property rights in China is closely linked to the prevalence of domestic violence, because when women's husbands abuse them, they have nowhere else to go to. They don't own that marital home. And there are also very few, or in some cases no, shelters for battered women. And these women who are abused by their husbands have basically no recourse. There is no law targeting domestic violence in China, despite many, many years of intense lobbying on the part of feminist lawyers and activists. I've met quite a lot of very inspiring and extremely courageous feminist activists in China, and I have a tremendous amount of respect and admiration for them. Unfortunately, China's really cracking down hard on women's rights groups, on all sorts of groups. There is a real crackdown on civil society. The government is really afraid of any organization that poses